Hey guys! Tonight we begin with something calm, something salty, something that smells faintly like your grandmother's spice cupboard and a tropical storm rolling in at a very leisurely pace. So ease back. Dim the lights. Let the day go soft around the edges. Because tonight we're drifting along the East African coast. And we're watching Swahili sailors do something wonderfully mundane, incredibly repetitive, and surprisingly soothing, packing cloves on the decks of dhows, in the warm quiet of a monsoon evening. If you've ever wanted to fall asleep to the gentle sound of historical spice logistics, congratulations. This is your moment. So, let's start floating. The Swahili coast, somewhere around the 14th century, liked to pretend it wasn't in a rush. Even though it absolutely was. Because monsoon winds don't care about your problems, your cargo, or the fact that your cousin promised he'd deliver those sacks of cloves on time, inshallah. The winds had their schedule, and they kept it with the casual arrogance of a medieval tax collector. But on shore, the rhythm was slower. Lamu, Pate, Zanzibar, Kilwa, these weren't exactly cities that felt the need to panic. They had carved coral towns, long-shadowed alleyways, and maritime cultures shaped by centuries of Indian Ocean trading. And above all that, the scent of cloves drifting in the air, settling into everything, from your clothes to your personality. Now, cloves weren't even native to these islands originally. They came from the Maluku Islands, the literal Spice Islands, halfway across the world. But by the time our Swahili mariners are packing them, cloves have already been adopted with the enthusiasm of an aristocrat discovering a new fashion trend. Zanzibar especially had become a clove hotspot, or at least a place trying to pretend it was one of the cool big international spice dealers. Which, to be fair, it kind of was. And cloves were weirdly valuable. They could preserve meat. They could freshen breath. They could hide the smell of whatever died in your ship's hold last season. A miracle product, really. But cloves needed to be packed properly before a voyage across the Indian Ocean. Otherwise they'd get damp and moldy, which meant your profit margin would disappear faster than a petty prince's dignity at a royal banquet. And so, it's packing time. Picture a dhow anchored in a quiet inlet. The hull creaks with the lazy sway of the tide. A few sailors are still hauling cargo, but most of the crew has settled into an unhurried choreography. They've done this every season since they were old enough to coil rope without falling overboard. The cloves arrive in baskets. Always baskets. Everything on the Swahili coast involves baskets at some point. They're woven from coconut fibers or palm leaves, and somehow manage to hold spices, fish, gossip, social expectations, and probably your career prospects too. The cloves are poured out to be checked. Each sailor sits with a small pile in front of him, sifting through them like a 14th century version of a bored cashier counting coins. The cloves must be dry. From deep reddish brown. If one looks pale or soft, it gets tossed aside, because mold is the enemy, the kind of enemy that doesn't wage war dramatically, but slowly creeps in until your entire cargo smells like a disappointed lemon. And as they sort, they chat in that laid-back way sailors do. Comments about wind patterns. Annoyances about a cousin who borrowed a fishing net 6 months ago and still hasn't returned it. Speculation about whether the merchant in Hormuz will try to haggle them down again this season. Because he always does, and he always acts like it's a surprise that cloves have a price. Once the sorting is done, it's time to pack. Now, the packing process was comically meticulous for something that involved men who regularly risked their lives on open seas. You'd think they might just scoop the cloves into sacks and call it a day. But oh no. There were rules. There were techniques. There were traditions so old that nobody remembered who invented them, but everyone swore they were absolutely essential, because that's how grandfather did it. The cloves were poured into long, narrow cloth bags, tight-woven cotton or sometimes coarse linen. The cloth needed to breathe just enough to keep the cloves from sweating, but not enough to let the humidity in. It was a delicate balance, like trying to regulate your sleep schedule as an adult. And as they filled each bag, the sailors shook it gently to help the cloves settle. The same motion over and over, hypnotic, repetitive, and calming. The bag filling. The soft rustle of cloves. The occasional grunt of someone who overpacked and now had to start again. When the bag reached just the right level, about 3/4 full, It was twisted shut in a tight spiral. Then tied with a thin rope, knotted in a pattern that looked simple but took forever to learn. A good knot meant your cloves didn't spill into the bilge water, which was basically the medieval equivalent of throwing gold coins into a swamp. And they'd stack these bags carefully. Always horizontally. Always in alternating layers. Because airflow mattered. And rot was the enemy. And sailors, for all their chaotic habits, understood moisture better than any medieval scholar writing a treatise on humors. Let's float over for a moment to the side of the deck, where another pair of sailors is weighing everything. Because of course weight matters. You couldn't overload a dhow. Well, you could, but then the dhow made rude creaking noises and took on water like a passive-aggressive warning. And sailors tended to take the hint. Weights were measured on a balance scale, using coral stones as counterweights. Practical, reliable, and readily available, because the Swahili coastline was basically one enormous coral reef waiting to stub your toe. A sailor lifts one of the spice bags. He gives it a shake. He listens to the sound, a soft, grainy whisper. Experienced ears could tell if it was too full. Some could even estimate weight within a handful of grams. Which was impressive, considering many of these same men routinely forgot whether they'd eaten lunch. If the bag passed inspection, it was approved with a nod so subtle it might as well not have existed. And then the sailor placed a charcoal mark on the cloth. Merchants loved their marks. They marked everything. Sex. Boxes. Ledgers. Probably their dreams too. But what's the next step? Well, cloves weren't the only thing getting packed. And our mariners knew they had a long journey ahead, weeks of drifting westward or eastward depending on the season, riding winds that arrived with the reliability of a bureaucrat and the personality of a sigh. So the cloves were only one part of a much larger ritual. A few meters away, another sailor is brushing oil into the spaces between wooden planks. He works slowly, rhythmically. This is caulking, using coconut fiber and fish oil to make the dhow watertight. The smell is distinctive. If cloves smell like a warm bakery in the afternoon sun, caulking smells like a fish market that has decided to develop character. But the combination, fish oil, wood tar, drying cloves, becomes strangely soothing when mixed with ocean air. The kind of scent that would make an aromatherapy company very nervous. Meanwhile, on shore, merchants supervise the process with the kind of stern, slightly theatrical seriousness that people use when they want to look more important than they actually are. They give orders. They count inventories. They pretend to know more than the sailors about sailing. But sailors are patient. They nod. They smile politely. And then ignore anything impractical, because no one wants to die because a merchant insisted on stacking sacks in alphabetical order. Let's drift back to the spice bags. Once a whole layer of bags is arranged in the cargo hold, the sailors roll woven mats on top, thick, heavy mats, often dyed with natural pigments. The mats act as insulation, as padding, and as a sentimental reminder that half of maritime life is just trying to stop things from sliding around. Layer by layer, the hold fills. And the dhow sinks a little deeper into the water, but safely, comfortably, like someone settling into a mattress. Outside, the ocean glimmers pale blue, the color of glass left in sunlight. The monsoon hasn't fully turned yet, but the wind carries a new possibility. A shift in temperature. A promise of direction. And the mariners feel it. They always do. Their lives revolve around it. A young sailor, probably on his first long voyage, looks toward the horizon, squinting like he expects the wind to give him a personal sign. An older sailor pats him on the shoulder and mutters something about patience. Winds arrive when they want to. Not earlier. Not later. And definitely not because a teenager with romantic ideas about the sea wants an adventure. But anyway, back to cloves. Before sealing the cargo hold, one more ritual must take place. A simple one. Easy to overlook, but vital. Every dhow carried a few small bags of emergency cloves. Not for trade, but for the sailors themselves. Because cloves were the medieval equivalent of a multipurpose hack. Toothache? Clove. Nausea? Clove. Seasickness? Clove. Bad breath because you forgot to drink water? Clove. Want to impress someone by pretending you understand herbal medicine? Oh look, it's cloves again. These emergency cloves were kept near the captain's quarters. A small, neat stash. Usually in a carved wooden box or a simple coconut shell container. One sailor is assigned to maintain it, a job somewhere between honorary responsibility and, please don't let the crew eat all of these in the first week. With everything packed, the crew gathers ropes, checks the mast, and adjusts the lateen sail so it catches the first nudge of the seasonal shift. The sail unfurls with a slow, graceful arc, like stretching after a long nap. The dhow's timbers creak softly, the kind of sound that could lull you to sleep if you were lying under the deck, listening to waves lap against the hull. And then the captain murmurs a prayer. Always a prayer. Calling on God for calm seas, steady winds, healthy crew members, and markets that don't engage in unreasonable haggling. The sailors echo it under their breath. Some sincerely, some automatically, some barely awake enough to form words. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the dhow begins to move. Not dramatically. Not with any fanfare. Just a quiet glide forward, following the tug of the tide. The cloves shift slightly in their bags, rustling like dry leaves. The wind sighs. A rope groans against a wooden beam. And the monsoon season begins its slow, gentle pull across the Indian Ocean. By the time the dhow settles into the steady rhythm of the open sea, the cloves have already made themselves known. Their scent drifts into every corner of the ship, slipping into the wood grain, settling into coils of rope, even clinging to the sleeves of the men napping along the stern. No one bothers trying to resist it. You don't fight cloves. You just accept your life now smells faintly like a spice bazaar. The crew moves in quiet routines. Morning starts before the sun decides to make the ocean pink. One sailor rises first, mostly because he sleeps lightly and partly because he snores so loudly that he wakes himself. He stretches, groans, and taps a clay pot to check if the drinking water sloshes the right way. If it sounds wrong, they refill. If it sounds right, they pretend not to worry. But the main concern on everyone's mind is the wind. Not in an exciting, storm-chasing way. More like waiting for a bus that only comes twice a year. The northeast monsoon is giving them a gentle push now, the exact kind of steady encouragement a dhow prefers. Nothing dramatic, nothing unpredictable, just a dependable nudge. Navigation at this point of the journey requires almost no speaking. The experienced sailors glance at the clouds. The slightly less experienced ones copy whatever the older sailors do, hoping no one notices. When they're unsure, they look at the waves instead, long, sloping swells that roll diagonally under the hull. The sailors read them the way scholars read manuscripts, except with fewer illuminated margins and more chance of getting wet. Someone adjusts the sail. Slowly. Because everything is done slowly on a monsoon voyage. Even when things matter, they never happen fast. A dhow lives in a world where time spreads out like soft cloth. Down in the hold, the cloves rest in their layered arrangement, cushioned by matting. Every now and then, the ship shifts just enough to make the bags give a faint, grainy sigh. It's an oddly comforting sound, like 100 tiny spices clearing their throats politely. Let's drift over to one of the older sailors lounging near the bow. He's chewing a clove, rolling it between his teeth with an expression that suggests both wisdom and mild annoyance. He's been sailing this route for decades, and he takes quiet pride in knowing exactly when the horizon looks wrong, though he never explains what wrong actually means. When a younger crewmate asks him, he usually shrugs and mutters something like, "You'll feel it when you feel it," which answers nothing but makes him sound authoritative. Meals are as uneventful as everything else. A pot of rice, often cooked into a soft consistency because crunchy rice is just too much excitement for a long voyage. Maybe some dried fish if it hasn't turned suspicious. Sometimes flatbread, sometimes a mashed mixture of beans and coconut milk. There is no culinary ambition here. Just fuel. Calm, unremarkable fuel. Every so often, one of the sailors sprinkles a few ground cloves into the rice, partly for flavor and partly for the illusion that they're eating something vaguely luxurious. It never fools anyone, but it passes the time. As the days yawn open and fold back into night, the ship moves in steady increments. No rush. No grand decisions. Just a long, slow migration along ancient ocean lanes. The Indian Ocean is generous like that, predictable, steady, and forgiving unless you do something extremely foolish like ignoring an obvious storm, insulting a captain, or trying to sail with a torn sail and pretending it's fine. But the real work, as always, comes with the maintenance of the ship. Toward midday, when the wind is warm and the horizon wavers slightly in the heat, two sailors crouch along the starboard side, scraping barnacles from the hull with the lazy determination of people who know the barnacles will come back anyway. It's a futile job, but an important one. Barnacles slow the ship. And even though the dhow isn't in a hurry, no one wants to be that slow. The scraping forms a familiar rhythm. Scrape, flick, sigh, scrape, flick. It's not music, but it could lull you just the same. Nearby, another sailor is mending a rope. He works the fibers with careful, precise motions, twisting and splicing, his fingers moving more gracefully than he would ever admit. Rope work is one of those skills everyone claims to know, but only a few truly master. A good rope splice can be the difference between a secure sail and a ripped one, and a ripped sail means turning the ship in circles while everyone glares at you. The rope mender doesn't talk much. He prefers the quiet, but he hums under his breath, something slow and repetitive, the kind of melody that might make you sleepy even before the sun goes down. Let's drift now to the horizon, where faint shapes sometimes appear, other ships, perhaps. Or just illusions created by heat, wind, and wishful thinking. But the sailors keep watch anyway. Mostly for comfort. It's nice to know you're not the only speck of humanity floating in this vast expanse of mild, unhurried ocean. When they do see another vessel, it's usually a distant silhouette of another dhow or a merchant ship from India, its broad, stitched sails catching the same breeze. Encounters at sea aren't dramatic. No shouted greetings across the waves. No sudden alliances. Just two ships noticing each other, acknowledging each other's existence, and then drifting apart again like acquaintances passing in a quiet street. By late afternoon, the crew settles into gentle tasks. One sailor oils the wooden rudder, brushing each stroke carefully so the wood doesn't dry out under the sun. Another checks the water jars, tapping them with the back of his knuckles as if they're tiny drums. There's no urgency. Just routines, slow, steady, unremarkable. Someone sweeps the deck. Not because it truly needs sweeping, but because sweeping gives your hands something to do while your mind wanders. Bits of dried seaweed, loose fibers from coiled rope, and the occasional grain of clove powder get brushed away. The broom leaves faint tracks across the planks, evidence of a day that existed even though nothing really happened. Night arrives the same way the morning did, politely. The sky turns lavender, then deep blue, then a soft, velvety black. Stars prickle through the darkness, spreading into familiar constellations that sailors have trusted since long before any of them were born. The Southern Cross leans diagonally, Orion rises with unhurried confidence, and the Milky Way spills quietly above them like pale ash. The captain stands near the stern, watching the stars with his hands clasped behind his back. He doesn't need to speak. The sky tells him everything. Latitude, direction, the mood of the night. He reads it with the same ease that others read prayer books. The younger sailors lie on the deck for warmth, letting the timbers radiate the heat collected during the day. They whisper to each other about future ports, Mogadishu with its stone houses, Aden with its sharp hills, Cambay with its markets that claim to sell everything except reasonable prices. The stories drift lazily, mixing with the smell of cloves and the salt in the air. Sometimes one of them falls asleep mid-conversation. No one wakes him. Sleep is the one luxury you don't interrupt on a voyage that lasts weeks. Below deck, the spice bags shift again, settling into their new arrangement now that the ship has glided into slightly different currents. They press against each other softly, held snug by ropes and mats. If Cloves could dream, they'd probably dream of dry warehouses and merchants arguing over profit margins. The next morning repeats itself almost exactly, because that's what monsoon sailing is. Repetition. Calm, predictable repetition. Rise before the sun. Check the water. Adjust the sail. Chew a clove. Stir the rice. Watch the waves. Repair something that probably didn't need repairing but might as well be repaired anyway. A dhow is a world where small tasks matter and big events rarely occur. Let's drift over now to a quiet conversation happening near the mast. Two sailors are debating how many voyages they've each completed. One claims he's sailed the Monsoon route 23 times. The other insists it's more like 17, which is still respectable but less impressive. They don't argue loudly. They don't even seem to care who's right. The debate exists mostly to pass the time, like all good maritime disagreements. Nearby, the ship's cook, a man who has resigned himself to feeding 12 sailors with a pot meant for 6, stirs something that might be stew, or porridge, or a creative blend of both. Whatever it is, it smells vaguely edible. He sprinkles in a pinch of ground clove, raises an eyebrow as if contemplating a deep philosophical decision, and then shrugs. When in doubt, add cloves. They make everything taste slightly more intentional. Sometime in the mid-afternoon, the wind shifts just enough to require adjusting the lateen sail. This is the most physically demanding task of the day, but even that feels slow and steady. The sailors haul the ropes with practiced movements, leaning back in unison, letting the sail swing into its new angle. The mast groans softly, then settles. The ship corrects its course by a few degrees. A dhow never rushes to change direction. It drifts into decisions the way a tired scholar drifts into sleep. The afternoon light grows hazy. The edges of the world blur. And somewhere below deck, a single clove bag emits a soft crunch as the ship hits a gentle wave. The sound is so quiet that only the closest sailor hears it. He looks down at the deck, shrugs, and decides the cloves are fine. They usually are. As evening rolls in again, the temperature drops. Someone pulls out a wool blanket woven in dark stripes. Someone else pours water into a small wooden cup, sipping it slowly to make it last. The crew settles into an unspoken agreement. Conserve energy, conserve supplies, conserve conversation. Night travels with them, calm and heavy, wrapping the ship in a quiet too deep to disturb. The stars glide overhead. The cloves rest. And the dhow continues, slow, steady, timeless, across an ocean that values patience above all else. Morning comes with a faint blush in the sky, a gentle reminder that time is still passing even though nothing on the ship seems particularly invested in proving it. The dhow has slipped farther along the monsoon corridor, drifting in that soft, steady way that makes days blend together like layers of lightly stirred coconut milk. No one is in a hurry to distinguish one sunrise from another. A monsoon voyage doesn't need variety to stay interesting, it needs rhythm, and it already has plenty of that. The crew moves through the usual motions. Someone coaxes a small fire in the clay stove. Someone else checks the cordage for signs of wear. A younger sailor wipes salt crust from the railings with surprising dedication, not because the railings truly care, but because the sailor likes the way the wood looks when he steps back and pretends he accomplished something. Below deck, the cloves continue their quiet existence. They settle deeper into the hold, forming their own sleepy microclimate of dry, spicy warmth. Every bag, tied shut with meticulous knots, rests in its assigned spot like a well-behaved guest at a very calm dinner party. Even the smallest movement of the ship sends a soft rustle through the pile, the faint, granular whisper of a cargo with zero interest in being dramatic. The sailors appreciate that. Drama is for land. Land has politics, taxes, relatives showing up unannounced. The ocean, especially during the monsoon, prefers simplicity. The wind blows predictably from one direction for weeks. The waves keep a uniform cadence. And the dhow glides forward with all the enthusiasm of someone taking a leisurely evening walk. Let's drift over to the steering oar, where the helmsman is doing exactly what he does every morning, lightly adjusting the ship's angle to keep it aligned with the wind. He doesn't grip the oar tightly. There's no need. The monsoon is cooperative today, blowing with the steady temperament of a particularly patient teacher. The helmsman watches the sky more than the water. Clouds mean more to him than waves. Thin, sweeping ones suggest high wind later. Dense, puffy ones promise humidity. A thick bank on the horizon could mean rain, though usually rain comes without warning. But even then, rain during the season is mild, the kind that pats the deck like an old friend tapping your shoulder. The younger sailors sit nearby, legs dangling over the side, tracing idle shapes in the air with their feet. One is weaving a bracelet from palm fiber. Another is carving a small wooden charm shaped vaguely like a fish, though it could also be a bird depending on how generous you want to be. None of them speak much. They don't need to. Silence stretches comfortably between them, not empty but restful. Later in the morning, the captain emerges from the shade of the small awning he calls his unofficial office. His beard is flecked with salt, which annoys him more than he would ever admit. He steps onto the deck with the slow authority of a man who knows he doesn't need to rush to be respected. He glances at the sky, the sail, the deck, the water jars, the cooking pot, the cloves, all in that same order he's been using for decades. A routine so fixed that even the sailors who barely notice anything else can predict it. He nods once. This is the sign that everything is acceptable. Perhaps not perfect, but acceptable. And on a voyage like this, acceptable is indistinguishable from excellent. A sailor approaches with a small wooden box, the emergency spice box. It contains a handful of cloves, a few cardamom pods someone added last season, and a cinnamon stick that has seen better days. The captain takes a single clove, bites it with the precision of a judge inspecting evidence, and lets its sharp warmth settle in his mouth. This is less about flavor and more about ritual. Every day begins with a clove. It's the maritime equivalent of a quiet meditation. Meanwhile, at the midpoint of the deck, a pair of sailors is engaged in the slow art of repairing a torn sail edge. The tear is tiny, practically microscopic, but ignoring microscopic problems is how you end up with catastrophic problems, and no one wants that. So they stitch carefully, using a large curved needle and thick thread. Each puncture of the needle into cloth makes a soft thup sound. Stable. Predictable. Pleasantly repetitive. Sail repairs are oddly soothing. They require just enough concentration to occupy the hands, but not enough to exhaust the mind. The sailors work side by side, matching their stitches like synchronized sleepers turning in a shared bed. Let's drift over to the cooking area again, where the ship's cook is once more coaxing something edible out of ingredients that barely qualify as ingredients. He stirs a pot of millet porridge, adding more water to stretch the mixture into respectability. Then he breaks a tiny piece of dried fish into it. Not enough to change the taste meaningfully, but enough to convince everyone that effort was made. A sailor leans over the pot, sniffs, and mutters something like, "Could use more clove." The cook pretends he didn't hear. The cook always pretends he didn't hear. When breakfast is finally served, the crew gathers around in loose, inefficient clusters. They eat with wooden spoons or with their fingers, depending on personal preference and how awake they feel. The sound of the porridge being stirred in bowls blends with the creaking of the hull and the ever-present whisper of the wind. It's not music, but it's the soundtrack of the voyage. As the sun climbs higher and the heat settles onto the deck, the sailors retreat to shaded corners. Some nap. Some braid rope. Some pretend to nap but are actually thinking about future ports, about markets full of shouting merchants who will scowl at their clove prices and then buy everything anyway. The thought is comforting. Not exciting, not stressful, just one more familiar part of the cycle. Around midday, the lookout calls down that he sees land. Not close, not clear, just a faint smear on the horizon. It might be a small island, or it might be nothing. Heat distortions love to impersonate islands. But the captain glances at it anyway, narrowing his eyes with a skepticism sharpened by years of false alarms. The sailors discuss it quietly. A few hope it's real, a few hope it's imaginary, no one feels passionately either way. That's the thing about a long voyage. You stop treating destinations like dramatic turning points and start treating them like gentle ripples on the surface of your daily routine. Eventually, the smear on the horizon resolves itself into nothing recognizable. The sailors lose interest. Someone points at a seagull instead. The appearance of a bird is, in fact, more reliably meaningful. Birds don't fly far from land. But even the bird seems in no hurry to reveal the location of anything useful. It glides overhead once, looks at the dhow with professional indifference, and continues on its way. Later in the afternoon, the wind softens. Not dies, just softens. The sail loosens slightly, flapping with a low, lazy sound. The crew adjusts it with the cooperation of people who have done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. The ropes slide through their hands with soft, fibrous whispers. The sail tightens. The dhow finds the wind again. Everyone returns to whatever they were doing. Let's watch a small moment that happens mid-deck. Two sailors are repacking a single spice bag that shifted awkwardly. They untie the knot with a kind of reverence, as if the bag is performing a shy confession. They reposition the cloves, smoothing, shaking, reshaping, then tie the spiral knot again. One of them comments that the cloves smell stronger today. The other shrugs and says cloves smell strong every day. A tiny philosophical divide, gently explored and then abandoned. Down in the hold, light filters through the gaps in the planks, turning the spice bags into soft, rounded shapes half hidden by shadow. The air down here is warm and dry, with a hint of the ocean pressing in from all sides. The scent of cloves saturates everything. You could probably drop a piece of cloth on the floor and it would come up smelling like a spice merchant's hopeful dreams. As evening approaches, the heat fades. The ocean darkens into deep blue. The sailors sit in small clusters, speaking quietly, voices low enough to blend with the wind. One of them begins telling a story, not an exciting one, not even a particularly interesting one. It's about a previous voyage in which a goat they were transporting escaped and spent 3 days hiding behind the water jars. The story is so uneventful that it becomes soothing by default. The crew listens not because the story matters, but because listening fills time with softness. When the stars return, the captain checks their positions again. Everything looks normal. The dhow stays on course. The monsoon holds its promise. The ocean breathes around them with patient regularity. One by one, the sailors settle down to sleep where they can, leaning against barrels, stretched along the deck, curled near the mast. Someone snores. Someone else mutters in their dreams. A third sailor kicks weakly at the air before relaxing again. And under all of this, the cloves remain perfectly still. They wait. They breathe their dry, warm aroma into the wooden bones of the ship. They endure the slow passage of time with the same quiet determination as the ocean itself. The dhow glides on. A world of spice, wood, wind, and unhurried purpose drifts into another night. If you ever want to witness an entire workforce moving at the speed of a bored house cat in the sun, you only need to observe the daily routines of dockside maintenance crews in the medieval Indian Ocean world. These were the men, occasionally women, who kept the dhows, booms, baggalas, sambucks, and all the other wonderfully named but fundamentally similar wooden ships in working condition. And they did this not with the dramatic flair you see in movies, where sailors are always either swinging from ropes or shouting orders in the middle of a crisis. Most of the time, the essential operations of maritime upkeep were so slow, so predictable, and so rhythmically monotonous that even the sea itself seemed to yawn. Let us begin with the docks themselves, not the lively bustle of merchants or the colorful jargon of spice trading, but the long, flat wooden planks where maintenance crews sat for hours with the energy level of people waiting for their laundry to finish. The routine usually started before dawn, when the air was cool enough that men willingly moved from their beds. At this hour, the docks were dim and blue, lit only by the glow of lanterns and the occasional embers of a fisherman's cooking fire. Crew members shuffled into place, still half asleep, still scratching their beards or rubbing their eyes as if hoping this would somehow make the day shorten itself by half. Their first task? Sweeping. The world's most universal, inescapable, unglamorous job. Medieval dock sweepers were armed with brooms made of bundled palm fibers, which were excellent at clearing fine dust and useless at everything else. They swept endlessly. Fish scales, rope fibers, sand, coconut husks, spilled grain, and the occasional indecipherable blob of something that had once been alive. The sweeping itself was done with barely any urgency. Most strokes were long, slow arcs, punctuated by long pauses where the workers seemed to be contemplating the meaning of life, or perhaps just counting how many more planks were left. Next came the rope inspection. A thrilling exercise of picking up long coils of coir rope, smelling them for mildew, and checking for fray points. This was a task that required exactly one brain cell, preferably a sleepy one. Coir rope, made from coconut husk fibers, was the single most important technology on the docks. The problem? Coir rope frayed constantly. Constantly. If rope could talk, medieval coir rope would have screamed, "I'm tired. I was literally made of shredded tree hair." What did you expect? Inspecting rope involved holding a coil up to one's face and squinting at it as if hoping it would confess its structural weaknesses out loud. If a rope was deemed too worn, it was tossed onto the "to unwind and retwist later" pile, a pile that grew steadily throughout the morning but somehow was never significantly smaller by sundown. Let's move our sleepy camera now to the carpenters. Dockside carpenters were the quiet heroes of the shipyard, though hero may be a strong word for someone whose job was 80% sanding. These craftsmen carried long slivers of coral stone files, wooden pegs, adzes, and chisels. Their primary goal was to keep the ship from falling apart, which is a pretty admirable mission, though the way they went about it looked about as energetic as a turtle crossing a warm road. The soundscape of the Carpenter's Corner is one of history's gentlest playlists. Slow rasps of coral stone on wood, the dull thud of a peg being tapped, the soft creak of timber, long, thoughtful silences, someone sniffing loudly and then saying nothing. The carpentry rhythm was meditative. Slow down a peg slot. Fit a new one. Sand the edge. Rub palm oil to seal the grain. Lean back. Consider life. Repeat. Occasionally, this piece was interrupted by the great drama of a carpenter dropping a peg into the water. This was followed by an entire sequence of events involving a sigh, a long stare into the sea, the slow removal of sandals, and a resigned wade into the water to retrieve it if the tide was low enough. If it wasn't, the peg was simply declared a sacrifice to the sea gods and work continued without further comment. And then there was the caulking. Oh, caulking, the spiritual core of maritime maintenance. The ritual where men stuffed rope fibers into the seams of ship planks and hammered them in with an almost hypnotic patience. The aim was to keep water out of the ship. Water, for its part, was extremely committed to getting in. So caulking was in a constant state of done but also never done. Medieval Indian Ocean caulking involved two main materials: coir fibers soaked in oil, creating a mushy, sticky rope blob. A wooden mallet, almost always swollen from humidity. The workers sat cross-legged along a ship's hull, pushing the fiber into the seam with a small iron wedge and tapping it with repetitive, sleepy thunks. Imagine the world's slowest, least enthusiastic percussion ensemble, playing a song titled, "I Would Rather Be Home." Let us drift now to the sail patchers. The sails, usually made of tightly woven cotton, were raised only on the open sea, but sail damage was always repaired on land. Patching sails was a task done in the shade, usually under a canopy that was constantly threatening to collapse if even a gentle breeze touched it. The patchers used bone needles roughly the size of small daggers, threading thick cotton cord through holes in fabric that liked to resist in every possible way. The act of sewing giant sails was less of a sewing motion and more of a long, dragging pull. First the needle went in, then the patcher grabbed the end of the cord with both hands, braced themselves, and pulled with the determination of someone trying to drag a stubborn goat. Every stitch was a full-body workout performed at a pace so slow you could measure it in minutes per stitch. Often, while sewing, the workers told stories, not energetic stories, but quiet, slow-burning tales about misbehaving goats back home, lost sandals, odd customers, strange weather, and what they believed the stars were trying to say that week. These storytelling sessions could last hours, punctuated only by the occasional ah, or you don't say. Meanwhile, a different crew maintained the anchors, massive stones or iron lumps, depending on the region, tied with ropes so thick it resembled a python. Anchor maintenance was mostly about untangling things. If sailors had a natural superpower, it was turning every rope on the ship into a knot of mythological complexity. Untangling these ropes required a process known as patient fiddling, involving many minutes of poking, pulling, and staring at the knot as if hoping it would resolve itself out of guilt. The final and slowest of the dockside tasks was inventory. An inventory worker sat cross-legged beside a pile of jars, pots, ropes, tools, and emergency coconut supplies. In front of him was a board covered in chalk marks and smudges from previous attempts. Count every item. Slowly. With an expression of intense concentration that suggested he was engaged in advanced celestial calculations rather than tallying wooden buckets. Counting small items like pegs and iron nails was the worst. Imagine a man counting to 37, being interrupted by someone walking past, forgetting the number, sighing deeply, and starting again. This happened at least 50 times a day. By afternoon, the inventory sheet was a blur of corrected numbers, crossed-out numbers, second attempts, third attempts, and at least one frustrated doodle of a fish. By the time the sun began to descend, the workers were coated in sawdust, rope fibers, and a thick layer of "I tried." The tide rose. The heat softened. Seabirds called from the pilings. And every worker, without exception, sat quietly and stared at the horizon for a few minutes. Not because they were reflective philosophers, but because standing back up felt like too much effort. In this final quiet glow of the day, the docks looked like a place where time had slowed down to half speed. The ship hulls glowed gold. The chairs creaked softly. Tools were put away one at a time, in the laziest possible order. Someone yawned. Someone else yawned in response. And slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the heavy calm, the workers shuffled home. Nothing dramatic happened. Nothing heroic. Just the slow, essential heartbeat of a maritime world shaped by patience, habit, and the gentle, unhurried rhythm of maintenance. A rhythm that, if listened to long enough, could put even the busiest mind to sleep. If daytime at an Indian Ocean port was a sleepy shuffle of maintenance, bargaining, and rope-related regret, nighttime shifted into an even slower register. So slow, in fact, that you sometimes wondered whether time had simply decided to pause until morning. But someone had to stay awake. Someone had to keep an eye on the ships, the warehouses, the animals, the lanterns, and the faint possibility that something mildly inconvenient might happen. Enter the port night watch, those stoic, underpaid, chronically bored guardians of the docks who patrolled with the enthusiasm of a man trying to stay awake during a cousin's endless wedding speeches. Their shift began at twilight, when the last maintenance workers dispersed and the first long shadows stretched across the water. The watchmen arrived in small groups, wrapped in shawls or coarse cotton cloaks depending on the climate. Each carried a wooden staff, not as a dramatic defensive weapon, but as a walking stick, a lantern holder, and a general-purpose object to lean on during long, contemplative pauses. The handoff between the day crews and the night watch was never exciting. There were no urgent instructions, no warnings of active threats. Just the night watch asking, "Anything happen?" And the day crew replying, "No," followed by both groups nodding in philosophical agreement. If a major incident had occurred at a medieval port, everyone would have been talking about it for months. The fact that nothing was happening once again was both expected and deeply comforting. The first responsibility of the night watch was lantern lighting. Ports at night were dim, hushed places, with lanterns arranged along the piers to create intermittent pools of warm, wobbly light. These lanterns burned oil, usually sesame, coconut, or a cheap fish oil that produced a smell which can only be described as historically accurate. Lighting them involved dipping a taper into a lantern, leaning back slightly to avoid getting oil on one's clothes, and then muttering a small curse at the wind if it blew the flame out again. Lighting the lanterns created a kind of soft, broken rhythm down the dock. Thick, thicker, thump of a staff, flicker. By the time the entire line of lanterns was lit, night had fully arrived, as if waiting politely for the ceremony to finish. After lantern duty, the night watch divided into patrols. Patrols were typically 2 people, not for strategic reasons, but because no one wanted to stay awake alone. Companionship helped prevent the number 1 enemy of night watch efficiency, accidental napping. Patrollers walked the length of the docks at a pace that could only be described as glacial. Their lanterns swayed, creating long streaks of gold across the boards. They listened to everything: the lap of the water, the distant shuffle of goats, the squeak of a rope pulley, the soft clunk of a hull settling with the tide. These were not ominous sounds, but familiar ones, part of the natural soundtrack of the port. Occasionally, patrols encountered fishermen returning late. The exchange usually went like this. "You're late." "Fish were stubborn." "Ah." And then both parties moved on. The night watch also kept an eye on animals. Port cats roamed freely, living their best lives among fish scraps and warm storage huts. The watchman knew most of these cats personally. They had names like Hooktail, Lantern, Shadow, Captain Fishbones, and the one who steals bread. When a cat wandered too close to the grain stores, a watchman would gently nudge it away with the end of a staff. Not out of anger, cats were universally tolerated, but out of fear of being blamed for paw print incidents in the morning. Dogs, too, drifted in and out of port life. Some ports loved dogs. Others tolerated them. A few pretended they didn't exist, even when one was clearly asleep under a pile of coiled rope. The night watch's attitude toward dogs varied from mild affection to long, sigh-heavy resignation. Then there were the goats. The goats. Every port had them, roaming freely, eating anything, challenging anyone. Night watchmen were constantly shooing goats away from things: lanterns, cargo nets, boats, and the occasional open barrel of produce. Only 3 things frightened a medieval dock goat: a broom, a thunderstorm, absolutely nothing else. Another central duty of the night watch was to monitor the tide markers, simple poles, carved stones, or scratched lines on the inner walls of piers. These markers told port workers how high or low the water had risen, which mattered for cargo loading schedules, repairs, and general bragging rights among sailors. Watching the tide was, in truth, a very slow activity. A watchman could stare at the water for 10 minutes and see no visible change. But this didn't stop them from doing it regularly. It was a meditative ritual, like checking a clock that rarely moved. Sometimes the watchmen gathered on a pier end to warm themselves around a brazier. Their conversations were soft and fragmented, consisting mostly of observations about the weather, recent odd dreams, small-town gossip, and philosophical reflections on whether fish could feel boredom. Every so often, someone would tell a story from years ago, a tale about a storm, or a stubborn merchant, or a goat-related disaster. The group would nod slowly, feeling the weight of time settling around them. The most action a night watchman typically saw was dealing with drunk sailors. Drunkenness was not a nightly occurrence, but when it happened dramatically. A sailor might stumble along the dock, loudly claiming he knew the secrets of the universe. The watchman's strategy was simple: guide the sailor back to his ship while offering quiet reassurances like, "Yes, yes, very wise, and let's walk carefully now." The goal was to avoid anyone falling into the water, not because it was dangerous, most could swim, but because fishing them out again required unnecessary exertion. Around midnight, the port reached peak stillness. The lantern flames shrank. The sound of waves grew soft. Even the goats went to sleep, which might be the clearest indicator that the universe was at rest. In this deep quiet, watchmen sometimes sat on the edge of the pier and dangled their feet above the dark water. They watched the stars reflected on the surface, forming shimmering constellations that rippled with every small movement of the tide. It was peaceful, almost hypnotic. Some watchmen passed the time by carving simple patterns into bits of driftwood. Others hummed tunes that were barely audible. A few practiced slow breathing exercises, trying to remain alert while their bodies insisted it was time to lie down and snore loudly. The oldest watchman of any given port always claimed he could hear the thoughts of the sea at night, though what those thoughts were he never clarified. As dawn approached, the sky shifted from deep indigo to dusty blue. Birds stirred. Cats stretched. The lanterns burned lower. This was the moment when time began to move again, as if the entire port were waking from a shared nap. The watchmen performed one last patrol, tapping their staffs along the boards to signal the end of the night shift. By the time the first workers arrived, yawning and tying headscarves, the night watch had already begun their slow shuffle home. No one thanked them, but no one needed to. Their work was not heroic or glamorous. It was simply necessary. They had guarded a quiet world during its quietest hours. And they had done so in the gentlest, sleepiest way imaginable. If ports were the beating hearts of monsoon trade, the repair crews were the steady, uncomplaining muscles quietly moving things along. Not quickly. Not dramatically. more like the slow flex of a sea cucumber deciding, gently, that it might wiggle a little to the left today. For every shiny departure and triumphant arrival, there was someone crouched under a hull, staring at a loose plank and sighing deeply. Repairs happened constantly. Not because ships were poorly made, but because wood, rope, salt, sun, and human ambitions simply had a way of disagreeing with one another. Every port had its own cluster of craftsmen, carpenters, rope splicers, caulkers, sail menders, who wandered around the docks with a resigned air of men who knew that if they didn't fix a thing today, they'd certainly have to fix a worse version of that same thing tomorrow. Their day began before sunrise, because that was the coolest hour and also the only time sailors weren't hanging around offering helpful suggestions. Repair crews preferred to work when no one was watching, partly for concentration, partly to spare themselves the unnecessary commentary of men who thought they understood carpentry because they once watched someone build a stool. Hull work was the most common task. The Indian Ocean's combination of warm waters, floating debris, and the occasional overly friendly barnacle meant that every dhow that sailed more than a few months accumulated its own small ecosystem. Cleaning this off required patience, scraping tools, and the ability to ignore the occasional sea creature expressing loud displeasure at being evicted. Repairers worked in slow, methodical motions. Scrape, pause, flick the debris into a bucket, scrape again. Sometimes they hummed to keep rhythm. Sometimes they complained softly about the angle of the sun, or the stubbornness of a plank, or the fact that someone else had clearly skipped maintenance 3 voyages in a row, because certain people, they would say, never learn. The soundscape of morning repairs was wonderfully boring. Gentle tapping, soft scraping, occasional murmured conversations that drifted away on the breeze. Nothing urgent ever happened, unless a plank split unexpectedly, at which point everyone paused, stared at it, and nodded as though the plank had personally offended them. Then they set about repairing it, still slowly, still calmly, because speed had absolutely no place in their philosophy. Caulking was a meditative art. Strips of coconut fiber or cotton were kneaded and teased apart, dipped in warm pitch, and gently pressed into the seams between planks. Caulkers often sat for hours, legs folded, swaying slightly as they worked. Visitors sometimes mistook this for drowsiness, but it was simply the traditional posture of someone fully committed to the act of stuffing gooey fiber into wood. Every port had a legendary caulker, usually an elderly man or woman, who everyone claimed could hear leaks. Supposedly, they could stand near a hull, tilt their head slightly, and say something like, "Starboard side. 4th plank below the waterline. Hit by an overconfident oarsman from Hormuz." Whether this was accurate or just an expression of local pride varied by location, but it made for pleasant storytelling. Sail repair crews worked on shore under shade awnings. From a distance, they looked like a group of quiet people sitting around a very large, very flat pet. They stitched rips with waxed thread, reinforced corners, and cursed seagulls with remarkable calm. Gulls had an uncanny habit of landing on the weakest part of any sail, as if conducting a personal experiment in gravity and fabric tolerance. Most sail repairs were simple, but some were practically philosophical. A sail that had been through 6 monsoon cycles needed not just sewing, but a gentle pep talk. Crews stroked the canvas lightly, saying things like, "You've had a good life," or "You can hold together one more season." Whether this helped the sail or simply soothed the humans is unclear, but the ritual persisted. Then there were rope repairs. Rope splicers were a distinct group, calm, patient, and deeply committed to the idea that any problem could be solved with enough rope and enough time. They sat cross-legged with coils around them like nests, fingers moving in slow, purposeful patterns. Splicing required total focus. One wrong twist could lead to a knot that gave out at the worst possible moment, usually while someone was carrying something expensive and fragile. Rope splicers had their own vocabulary. They spoke of lazy strands, rebellious fibers, and uncooperative coils. If you asked them what made a good rope, they'd say something like, "It listens," as though rope possessed a moral character. And honestly, after enough hours spent splicing, maybe it did. By mid-morning, the sun warmed everything. Tools heated up. Planks dried. Workers sighed and took longer breaks. Shade became a precious commodity. Repair crews gathered under boat hulls or palm leaf shelters, sipping cool water from glazed earthen jars. They didn't talk much at these moments. Silence suited them. The sea murmured nearby, filling in the conversational gaps. After resting, the crews inspected rigging. Rigging checks were slow walks along masts and beams, tapping with knuckles or the handle of a knife, listening for the subtle sound of weakness. Good would produce a satisfying, confident thump. Bad would produce a sound best described as embarrassed. Repair crews took note of embarrassed wood. They remembered it. They returned to it later, approaching it like a disappointed parent dealing with a child who had skipped chores. One thing that separated Swahili and Indian Ocean ship repair culture from others was its attitude toward improvisation. Repairs did not need to be pretty. They simply needed to work. The plank could be mismatched. A rope could be spliced 3 different ways. A patch of pitch could look like someone dropped it accidentally. As long as the ship floated and the cargo stayed dry, it was a triumph of engineering. Around noon, repairs slowed to nearly nothing. Heat pressed down. Tools grew sluggish. Workers retreated again to shade, eating small lunches, dates, bread, dried fish, or leftover stew, and telling stories about past voyages. These stories were rarely dramatic. More often they involved mild annoyance, small inconveniences, and the unending war between sailors and the unsolicited advice of merchants. The afternoon was for finishing touches, replacing missing pegs, smoothing rough spots, testing sail seams by giving them gentle tugs, checking rope lengths against faded memory alone, because no one actually measured anything unless absolutely necessary. This was the time when a ship slowly transformed from worryingly worn down to comfortingly seaworthy again. Repair crews had a habit of pausing to admire their work. Not proudly, just contemplatively. They'd tilt their heads, squint slightly, and think very slow thoughts. Sometimes 2 workers would stand side by side, stare at a newly repaired section, nod together, and walk away without a word. This was the ancient maritime equivalent of a performance review. One curious ritual carried across many ports, blessing the repaired hull. This was not a dramatic ceremony. No chanting, no incense. A repairer simply tapped the hull twice with his staff or mallet, said something like, "There," and moved on. Travelers often interpreted this as superstition, but really it was just a way of declaring the work done so that no one felt compelled to add just one more adjustment, which every craftsman knew was the road to eternal torment. Late in the afternoon, ship captains returned to inspect the repairs. Captains approached their vessels with arms crossed, pretending to understand every detail even if they couldn't tell a splice from a particularly determined piece of seaweed. Repair crews explained everything in slow, patient tones. Captains nodded far too many times. Everyone knew the ritual.
Payment was usually in coin, cloves, cloth, or promises of future favors. No one liked the promises, but they happened anyway, because sailors believed, with stunning optimism, that they would remember them. Repair crews knew better. They accepted the promises anyway, because someday, somewhere, someone might vaguely recall them. As evening approached, the day's repairs wrapped up. Tools were cleaned and hung carefully. Buckets of pitch were sealed. Sawdust was brushed off planks. Workers stretched their backs, rubbed their wrists, and let the last rays of sun dry the remaining moisture on the hulls. Ships sat slightly taller in the water, slightly straighter, slightly more ready for the next voyage. The repair crews walked home slowly, leaving the port in the soft light of sunset. Tomorrow they would return to do more slow scraping, more patient stitching, more philosophical rope twisting. Their work was never done, but it was steady and calm and quietly essential to the drifting rhythm of the Indian Ocean world. Harbors around the Indian Ocean did not run on strict bureaucracies or formal offices. They ran on something much gentler, the slow-moving, soft-spoken, quietly indispensable work of go-betweens. These were the men and occasionally women who drifted between merchants, captains, officials, sailors, and whoever else happened to be standing vaguely in the way, stitching together a kind of informal diplomacy, one mutter conversation at a time. If you wanted permission to unload Cloves without waiting 3 eternities, you talked to a go-between. If you weren't sure which official was in charge of measuring cargo today, you talked to a go-between. If you suspected a rival captain might be planning something mildly irritating, a go-between would tell you he was not planning anything at all, because he was actually asleep under a canopy and would absolutely not be waking up anytime soon. Their job wasn't exciting. It wasn't even particularly dramatic. But in a world where dozens of cultures met on a single shore, someone had to maintain the chill, and the go-betweens took this responsibility very seriously. Most harbors had several layers of them. There were the senior go-betweens, older men with calm voices and soft sandals who moved with the slowness of people who had long ago mastered the art of wasting no unnecessary energy. They wore simple white garments or long robes, nothing ostentatious. Their authority came not from their clothes, but from the fact that everyone trusted them to know everything worth knowing. Then there were junior go-betweens, apprentices who followed the seniors with bundles of notes, extra scrolls, or the universal symbol of diplomacy, a jug of watered wine. Their job was mostly to watch, listen, and occasionally run errands at a speed that could almost be described as brisk if you squinted very generously. Go-betweens began their day early, walking along the docks at a gentle pace, greeting workers, checking which ships had arrived overnight, and making mental notes like, "This captain looks overwhelmed. Avoid offering complicated explanations. That merchant is wearing his 'I intend to haggle for 3 hours' tunic. The customs inspector appears to be eating breakfast again. Schedule conversations accordingly." They approached their tasks with a kind of practiced serenity. If someone yelled, which did happen occasionally in multicultural ports, especially when two men discovered they both claimed ownership of the same crate of grain, the go-between stood quietly nearby, waiting for the argument to soften into confusion. Once the initial energy drained out, they intervened with lines like, "Let us take a moment," or "Perhaps the crate wishes to belong to neither of you," or the evergreen classic, "Shall we sit in the shade and think?" And somehow, without anyone quite remembering how, the problem dissolved. One of the most delicate tasks of go-betweens was translating not just words, but intentions. The languages shifting around the port were many: Swahili, Arabic, Persian, Gujarati, Malay, Tamil, and more. Translating literally was easy. Translating politely was an art form. For example, a Persian merchant might say something like, "This cargo inspector is slower than winter's shadow." The go-between would translate this into gentle Swahili as, "He respectfully wonders whether the inspection might proceed soon." Or a Swahili captain might mutter, "The trader is trying to charge the price of a full kingdom for this rope." And the go-between would turn to the Gujarati merchant and murmur, "He hopes for a slightly more flexible price." Everyone got the message, of course. The real meaning floated underneath, like the soft undercurrent of the tide. Much of their time was spent escorting people from one location to another. A merchant from Kilwa might need to meet a cloth dealer from Cambay. A captain from Mombasa might be summoned by the port official who handled weights and measures. A sailor might need permission to unload a suspiciously large number of baskets labeled "Definitely not spices." Go-betweens walked with them, providing small talk to ease the mood. They pointed out which parts of the harbor currently smelled the least like fish. They commented on the pleasantness of the morning tide. They made gentle jokes about goats who had attempted piracy by climbing onto unattended boats. They didn't hurry. Hurrying was beneath them. Their calmness was their professional weapon. Harbor officials relied heavily on them. Officials technically held power, but often preferred to avoid direct confrontation. Go-betweens helped by filtering information. A port officer might ask, "Does that foreign merchant seem honest?" And the go-between might say, "He seems tired," which, in the language of the docks, meant, "He is stressed, but not criminal." Or an officer might ask, "Is the captain likely to cause problems?" To which the go-between might answer, "He is very focused on the weather," meaning, he wants to leave quickly. Treat him gently. These subtle exchanges maintained the delicate equilibrium of the harbor. Nothing escalated. Nothing broke. Nothing required shouting. Go-betweens were also archivists, in their own unofficial way. They remembered who had sailed where, who owed what, which ships had reputations for leaking suspiciously, and which merchants had a habit of overpacking cloth bundles until the seams groaned. Their memories formed a living database that officials often tapped into when paperwork failed, paperwork being notoriously unreliable in climates where humidity had a personal vendetta against ink. Afternoons were spent managing misunderstandings, which arrived like the tide, gently, predictably, and in large quantities. A ship docking in the wrong berth. A cargo owner forgetting which warehouse contained his own goods. Two merchants arguing over identical-looking bundles of cinnamon. A sailor loudly insisting that he had already paid docking fees last month, even though he had clearly not been in this port for over a year. Go-betweens solved these problems by asking soft questions until the truth slowly revealed itself. They listened, nodded, asked a follow-up question, nodded again, and gradually guided both parties to the faint realization that they were arguing over something trivial.
They never said, "You're both wrong," even when both parties were deeply, profoundly wrong. Instead they murmured, "Let us begin again," which worked astonishingly well. Even evenings involved work. Go-betweens walked between lantern-lit gatherings of sailors, merchants, and travelers to check that nothing was drifting toward conflict. They were trained in recognizing early signs of trouble. A sailor leaning forward too much. A merchant repeating the same sentence 3 times. A group of men suddenly whispering instead of talking normally. A cat fleeing the scene for no obvious reason. When such signs appeared, the go-between would approach with their signature weapon. A plate of dates, or a jug of watered wine, or sometimes just a question so slow and gentle it derailed whatever rising tension had started. Would anyone like to sit closer to the breeze? Shall we step aside and discuss the matter quietly? Perhaps we should let the night think for us. The go-between's success came from their utter refusal to be ruffled. Even the most stubborn sailor eventually realized that arguing with someone who radiated pure calm was pointless. By the time night deepened and the lanterns flickered low, the go-betweens walked home through silent streets. They carried no documents, no official seals, no heavy responsibilities. Yet the entire harbor had flowed smoothly because of them. Not perfectly, perfection was never expected, but gently, like a tide following its familiar path. Their work left no monuments, no epics, no grand records. Just a lingering sense of peace in the harbor they tended, one quiet conversation at a time. By the time the sun dropped low and the monsoon breeze settled into its predictable, almost ceremonial gentleness, the medieval Swahili harbor would slip into its evening personality, slower, softer, and governed by a set of unwritten rules that every sailor, trader, porter, guest, and wanderer somehow seemed to know. Not dramatic rules. Nothing romanticized or thunderous. Just sleepy etiquette. The type shaped not by kings or scholars, but by tradition, comfort, and the unspoken desire for everyone to simply get through the end of the day without unnecessary fuss. Because the truth is, in a port city that had already spent all morning arguing over coral stone weights, all afternoon unloading cloth bales and rice sacks, and all early evening checking whether someone's cousin's cousin truly had the authority to stamp a warehouse seal, by nighttime, people were tired. Collectively tired. Agreeably tired. Ready for the quiet. And so begins the gentle choreography of harbor evenings. The slow drift toward the waterfront. As dusk seeped into the alleys, the first unofficial rule of evening was simple. Move toward the water. Slowly. Not because anyone ordered it. Not because it was fashionable. But because the breeze was cooler there, and after an entire day of packed courtyards, shouting porters, and hot coral block walls radiating heat back onto everyone's shins, people instinctively migrated to the shoreline. Dhow crews tied up earlier in the afternoon would sit in clusters on the sand, sorting their personal gear into tiny piles, rope scraps, wooden bowls, patched cloth bags, the occasional brass cup inherited from someone who definitely hadn't purchased it legally in Aden. Swahili townspeople would mix casually among them. A fisherman's son might sit beside a Gujarati bead trader. A Yemeni cleric, just landed, might lean against a Faza-born sailor while scribbling notes about the local pronunciation of certain words. A Kilwa cloth merchant might share a mild joke with a captain from Mogadishu who'd sworn he was leaving at dawn, for the last 4 days. Everyone coming together, not for business, not for bargaining, but for the universal activity of not doing very much. It was one of the few times in the day when no one pretended to be in a hurry. The lantern ritual. When the sky turned indigo and the tide began mumbling against the pilings, the harbor watchmen appeared with their lanterns. This wasn't a grand patrol. It was not militaristic or rigid. More like a wandering, slow-motion inspection performed by men who had done this every evening since adolescence. They moved through the harbor at a pace best described as unmotivated but responsible. First lantern lit, hung beside the customs house, its warm glow flickering against crates stamped with 3 different kingdoms' merchant seals. Second lantern, near the staircase that led up to the town's main street, faintly illuminating the carved coral steps that sailors always tripped on if they weren't paying attention. Third lantern, along the waterline, its reflection trembling over the anchored dhows. This ritual didn't symbolize anything dramatic. It was simply practical. A quiet way of saying, the day is done. Mind your step. Go slow. Sailors swore the lantern light kept the harbor spirits calm. The clerics rolled their eyes at this. The clerics' wives, however, absolutely believed it and insisted the lanterns be maintained. One of those universal traditions. The men argued. The women ensured the arguing did not interrupt the lantern process. Meals that lasted forever but were incredibly simple. Dinner in a medieval Swahili harbor was never rushed. Even when the food itself was basic, rice steamed in clay pots, grilled fish with minimal seasoning, pieces of coconut cut into quarters, the occasional pot of lentils or cassava, the meal extended itself like it had all the time in the world. Partly because everyone was tired, partly because hot food after a long port day felt like an anchor, and partly because once you sat down, standing up again felt like a commitment no one was quite ready for. So people lingered. Small groups formed around shared plates. Crewmates ate beside townsfolk. Conversations drifted into the comfortable category of harbor nonsense. Stories of a neighbor's cousin who swore their cat alerted them to monsoon shifts. Complaints about how rope prices were rising again. Debates about whether a certain dhow from Muscat would ever actually leave. Gentle gossip about someone's missing sandal, usually an innocent sandal, occasionally, scandalous sandal. But no matter the topic, voices stayed soft. A harbor evening meal was not a place for loud opinions or heated arguments. People saved those for the daytime, when yelling had the dignity of purpose. At night, the goal was simply to keep the rice warm and the conversation warmer. Music that was not really a performance. Some evenings, a player of the UD or the Z's might settle near the harbor edge. But these musicians were not performing. Not in the theatrical sense. They played because their hands were used to it. Because the rhythm soothed the day-hardened muscles in their shoulders. Because a melody in the humid night made a long voyage feel less far from home. The music drifted lazily, never demanding attention, never rising above the murmur of water and distant conversations. Sailor from Hormuz, you call that tuning? Swahili musician, plucking another string, I call that working with what I have. Laughter. So uncompetitive. Sometimes, a child would wander over and try to touch the instrument. The musician would gently reposition it, saying something like, not that part. That part bites. The child would gasp. Everyone knew the instrument didn't bite. But the lie was part of the tradition. The quiet territorial behavior of cats. Every important medieval port had cats. Swahili towns had many. They were unofficial employees of the harbor, rat deterrents, fish thieves, expert loafers, and occasionally, audience members. Evenings were their prime time. As people sat on the sand and stone steps, cats strolled among them with a calmness that suggested they owned the place. A crew of sailors finishing dinner? The cats inspected them. A group of merchants discussing route plans? Cats walked directly across their maps. A drowsy customs clerk trying to finish his last notes before bed? A cat would absolutely sit on his paperwork. Everyone accepted this. Harbor cats operated under their own etiquette code. Walk slowly. Sit wherever the humans want to put their hands. Pretend the lantern glow is your personal spotlight. Ignore all command structures. Some sailors insisted cats could sense monsoon changes. Others claimed the cats simply enjoyed the authority of being unpredictable. Either way, they were part of the scenery, small, graceful reminders that the harbor belonged to more than just the humans working it. The final conversations before sleep. As the night deepened, groups gradually thinned. Those with beds inland drifted back toward the coral stone houses. Those sleeping on their dhows climbed aboard slowly, stepping lightly to avoid waking early sleepers. These final conversations tended to be the softest. If the wind shifts by morning, we'll leave. If the crew sobers up by morning, we'll leave. If no one steals our anchor by morning, we'll leave. If someone actually finishes repairing that sail, we'll leave. A lot of maritime plans relied on if. But that was acceptable. In port life, certainty was a luxury, patience was a rule. Before the lanterns were finally trimmed for the night, the last people lingering by the waterline exchanged simple goodnights. Kesho. Tomorrow. Kesho kutwa. The day after tomorrow. The more realistic option. Then silence settled in, soft, layered, peaceful. The harbor, which had spent its entire day roaring with energy, cooled into something calm enough to cradle even a restless mind. A final swell brushed against the hulls. A final cat circled twice and sat. And the entire waterfront exhaled. Because evening etiquette wasn't about rules. It was about rhythm. About letting the day dissolve gently into the sea breeze. About acknowledging that even in a world bustling with trade, travel, and ocean-crossing ambitions, everyone deserved a slow ending to the day. A harbor evening was, in its quiet, flickering lantern way, a nightly reminder. The ocean can wait. Tomorrow will come. For now, rest. If the daytime bustle of a medieval Swahili harbor was loud enough to rattle loose coral dust from the walls, then dhow maintenance was the exact opposite. A slow, meditative practice conducted by men who had perfected the art of looking extremely busy while actually doing things at a pace designed to avoid excessive sweating. Dhow maintenance, whether in Kilwa, Mombasa, Mogadishu, or Zanzibar, wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dramatic. It rarely involved shouting unless someone stepped on a misplaced nail or dropped a pot of pitch. Mostly, it was the maritime equivalent of tidying your room because guests might arrive. Someday, maybe, depending on the monsoon. But the maintenance had to be done. And it was done with an unhurried dignity that only experienced sailors could muster. The early morning ritual of not starting yet. Dhow repair often began in the morning, but not immediately in the morning. There were steps. Arrive near the beach dhow. Sit on the sand. Comment on the weather. Sip whatever morning drink was available. Make a thoughtful face while staring at the hull. Suggest that perhaps the tide tomorrow will be better for real work. From the outside, it looked like nothing was being done. From the sailor's perspective, this was planning, a vital stage requiring stillness and mild skepticism. And after all, if repairs were done too quickly, then someone might assign new tasks. No one wanted that. Checking the hull, mostly with hands and vague squinting. Eventually, one or two sailors would stand and begin inspecting the hull. This mostly meant running a hand along the planks, nodding slowly, and making quiet noises of disapproval. Yeah. None of which were attached to any specific diagnosis. The Swahili shipbuilding tradition relied heavily on tactile intuition. For example, tap a plank. If it sounded right, good. If it sounded wrong, someone would say, H. Press a seam with your thumb. If it felt firm, good. If it felt soft, someone would mumble, needs attention. Look at the dhow from a distance. If the overall shape still resembled a functioning vessel, excellent. And if someone didn't quite know what they were looking at, they could still participate by doing the universal sailor action, leaning on something while frowning thoughtfully. That alone counted as contributing. The unhurried art of applying pitch. Pitch, thick, sticky, stubborn, was the essential material for waterproofing. Heating it required a careful, patient fire. Too hot, and it burned. Too cold, and it clumped like an offended snail. Sailors squatted around the pot, stirring it at the pace of monks contemplating eternity. Applying pitch to the seams was equally slow. A sailor dipped a pad of cloth into the pot, lifted it carefully, and dabbed the sticky mixture along the seams between planks. This was not a task for rushed hands. A hurried application meant leaks. Leaks meant bailing. Bailing meant tired arms. Tired arms meant grumpy sailors. Thus, pitch work naturally became one of the most leisurely activities in Swahili maritime life. At any point, someone might pause mid-stroke to comment, "This pitch is thicker than yesterday." Everything is thicker than yesterday. That is true. These conversations could last half an hour without any emotional movement. Sewing the planks together. Dhow hulls weren't nailed, they were stitched, an engineering marvel that confused foreign travelers and impressed them at the same time. The process involved coconut fiber rope, holes drilled precisely, long, deliberate movements, and the deeply serious expression of someone threading a needle in slow motion. A sailor would sit beside the hull, legs stretched out, pulling the rope through plank holes with a steady rhythm. It created a lullaby of friction and fiber. The repetition lulled even the workers into a half-drowsy state. Observers, especially new crew members, often fell asleep watching this. Old sailors claimed it was impossible to rush stitching. If you tried, the rope protested by fraying just enough to inconvenience but not enough to break. Thus, the dhow taught patience to its caretakers. The mysterious case of the perpetually missing tools. Every boat repair featured at least 3 missing tools. The good mallet. The sharpest awl. The rope someone swore they left, right there. These items developed a habit of migrating under baskets, behind planks, or into someone's bag entirely by mistake. Tool searches were never urgent. No one panicked. No one yelled. Instead, the crew wandered around the beach or shipyard area, lifting objects with mild curiosity. Finding the missing tool prompted a reaction such as, "There it is." Not celebration. Not triumph. Just quiet relief, as though the tool had been on a short personal journey and had now returned home. Sail repairs. A study in taking breaks. Sails, woven from sturdy cotton or palm fibers, required regular patching. The sewing was done under shade, which meant the workers inevitably grew sleepy. A typical sail repair session went like this. Start stitching. Comment that the sun is too bright. Adjust shade. Stitch 2 lines. Take a sip of water. Stitch half a line. Lean back and sigh for reasons no one needs to specify. Stitch 2 more lines, perhaps. And every now and then, "CD, are you asleep?" "No. I'm resting my eyes." This was always accepted without question. A person resting their eyes while holding a needle was simply part of dhow culture. The auditory landscape of a shipyard. The soundscape of dhow maintenance was surprisingly soothing. The gentle scrape of wood planes. The soft thunk of mallets. The swoosh of ropes sliding through plank holes. The low hum of sailors humming old monsoon songs. Distant waves brushing the hull. The occasional seagull expressing an unprovoked opinion. There were no loud machines. No hammering storms of metal. Just the rhythm of hands and wood and rope. For many, it was a background lullaby. Children who played nearby often fell asleep beside unfinished hulls. Visitors found themselves yawning after half an hour. Even sailors joked that the boats were designed to hypnotize anyone working on them. Cooperative laziness, the true secret of boat longevity. Foreign observers sometimes assumed the slow pace meant inefficiency. But old Swahili crews knew the secret. A boat repaired slowly is a boat repaired well. Rushing meant stress on the planks. Stress on the planks meant leaks. Leaks meant sinking. And sinking was universally considered inconvenient. So, the maritime communities practiced a shared philosophy. Keep the dhow alive by moving slowly enough that nothing breaks, including your own back. They did not frame this in poetic terms. They simply lived it. The day's end, admiring work that looks suspiciously the same as before. As the sun lowered and the tide crept in, the crew would stand back and inspect the day's progress. Often, the dhow looked almost identical to the morning. But sailors nodded with satisfaction anyway. "A good day's work," someone would say. "Yes," another agreed. "We did not hurry." And that was the metric. Not how much was finished. Not how different the boat looked, but how responsibly they had avoided unnecessary strain. A final round of slow bracing, gentle tapping, and rope coiling followed. Then, as they packed up tools and settled into the evening breezes, someone might mutter, "Tomorrow we finish." They never finished tomorrow. But that was part of the charm. Because in the world of medieval Swahili dhows, maintenance wasn't a task. It was a rhythm, a tradition passed through generations, a communal permission to slow down in a life dominated by tides and wind. And so the dhow rested, and the sailors rested, and the harbor exhaled its steady, salt-scented breath. As night deepened and the harbor grew quieter, another essential, sleep-inducing aspect of Swahili maritime life went largely unnoticed by casual observers: the careful, meticulous handling of cloves. Not the sort of cloves you sprinkle on food in a hurry, but the treasured, fragrant pods that traveled across oceans, sustaining entire trading networks, and inspiring very slow, highly methodical routines. Cloves were valuable. They were delicate. And the wrong handling could turn a profitable shipment into a disappointing pile of brittle brown sticks. Thus, harbor workers, merchants, and sailors approached clove storage with the same calm patience that guided everything else in the port: slow, deliberate, and gently ritualistic. Morning sorting, touching cloves softly. The day's clove work began early, though as with all harbor activities, early was relative. Bundles arrived in woven palm baskets, each tied carefully with palm fiber cords. Workers unbound them with hands that moved more gently than a lullaby. Every clove was touched, not poked, not inspected aggressively. This tactile attention was not a sign of obsession, it was practical. Cloves are small, fragile, and prone to losing their essential oils if handled roughly. So a typical sorting session consisted of picking a handful of cloves, rolling them gently between palms, noting any that were broken or oddly shaped, placing the good ones in one pile, placing the questionable ones in another, larger, vaguely labeled pile. Conversations during sorting were slow, almost ceremonial. "Are these old?" "No, they seem calm." Calm is good." And that was sufficient assessment. No one demanded more precision. The day was long and the cloves would wait. Stacking and layering, a study in patience. Once sorted, cloves were packed into storage containers. This was more art than science, though that didn't prevent a lot of quiet debate about the proper arrangement. Layers of dried palm leaves to separate each clove batch. Small sprinklings of aromatic herbs to maintain scent, sometimes cinnamon or sandalwood. Gentle tamping, not too hard, not too soft, to prevent crushing. The containers were simple: clay jars, woven baskets, or wooden boxes. All required careful labeling, usually with ink rubbed in so softly that some historians suspect the labels were partly decorative. A worker might spend 10 minutes gently sliding a jar into position, then pause to admire how it fit among its neighbors. Someone else might nod thoughtfully, saying, This jar has the proper respect for its companions." Which was true in a way that outsiders would never understand. The role of humidity and temperature in sleep-inducing detail. Swahili port towns were humid, which had consequences. Cloves did not appreciate humidity any more than sailors appreciated unexpected rain. Workers learned to read subtle signs. A slight dampness in a basket. The faint smell of fermentation. A subtle droop in palm leaf layers. If any of these appeared, the crew did not panic. Instead, they moved the container to a slightly higher shelf, or gently lifted the lid, or whispered mild encouragement to the cloves. The careful manipulation of climate inside storage areas was slow, methodical, and calming to watch, if one had the patience to observe it. Loading cloves for the dhow, a ritual of gentle precision. Once cloves were sorted, layered, and deemed suitably calm, they were ready for transport. Loading involved carrying baskets to the ship in pairs, lowering them gently to the deck, never dropped, arranging them carefully to balance weight evenly, leaving small spaces between stacks to allow air to circulate, occasionally pausing to adjust a basket or check its scent. Each action took time. No one hurried. Any attempt at haste was immediately corrected by the collective wisdom of centuries. Rough handling would crush the Cloves, upset the ship's balance, or offend the monsoon spirits. At times, a sailor might sigh and mutter, "I thought we were halfway done." And another, adjusting a basket with the care of a jeweler handling diamonds, would respond, "No. Halfway would imply urgency. This is patience." Which everyone accepted. Securing Cloves against moisture and theft. The tropical harbor environment posed two main risks to Clove shipments. Moisture. Opportunistic hands. Both were addressed slowly without alarm. Moisture. Tarps or woven mats covered containers. Workers gently patted down corners to ensure no water seeped in. They avoided stomping or hammering. Every motion was deliberate, with pauses to consider if the next move might be too energetic. Theft, not a matter for dramatic guard posts. Instead, subtle psychological techniques were employed. Placing baskets so they seemed ordinary. Positioning older, gentler sailors nearby, whose sleepy vigilance was paradoxically intimidating. Occasionally letting a cat wander across the deck for mysterious deterrence. The result was effective. Cloves arrived at their destination intact, fragrant, and calm. Afternoon checks and the ritual of reassurance. Even after loading, the Cloves were not ignored. Workers would return in the afternoon to gently lift lids, breathe near the baskets, and confirm. No condensation formed. No unwanted pests were present. No baskets had shifted unnaturally. Some sailors whispered to the Cloves, "You are well. You are calm. We will not disturb you again until morning." While the practice may sound absurd, it was universally respected. The ritual reinforced order, patience, and the quiet rhythm of harbor life. Observers often found it hypnotic. Evening reflection, watching Cloves sleep. As the sun began to lower and the lanterns flickered to life along the dock, the workers often paused near the clove-laden dhows. They would stand, hands clasped behind their backs, surveying the cargo. The crates and jars, neatly arranged, seemed to glow softly in the lantern light. No one spoke. No one moved. The Cloves rested. The harbor exhaled. It was a shared moment of calm, a subtle acknowledgement that for this day at least, everything, ships, spices, sailors, and the ocean itself, was exactly as it should be. And then, slowly, the workers drifted home, leaving the Cloves to their night, as the soft, salt-tinged breeze whispered across the decks. In a Swahili harbor, where dhows rocked gently against the tide and lanterns swayed in a predictable rhythm, there existed a task so quietly tedious it could lull even the most attentive sailor into a slow, contemplative stupor: cargo accounting. Not the kind involving dramatic pen and ink flourishes or frantic ledger corrections, but the calm, deliberate process of checking, rechecking, and occasionally sighing at piles of goods. Cargo accounting was, in many ways, the heartbeat of the port. Ships arrived, merchants unloaded, and someone, usually a clerk in a long, sun-faded robe, would carefully document everything. Not quickly, not efficiently, but thoroughly, slowly, and with a subtle air of mild judgment. Morning preparations, sitting before the piles. Accounting began not with numbers, but with observation. The clerk would approach the cargo area, lean slightly against a crate, and allow their eyes to drift lazily over the stacks of goods. Cloves, cinnamon, cotton, ivory, copper ingots, dried fish, everything arranged in neat, calm, almost hypnotic order. Their first step was to make mental notes. That basket of rice seems slightly sun-bleached. The copper ingots are heavier than yesterday, or perhaps I am weaker. A goat seems to have inspected the sesame. Then, after these important observations, the clerk would open the ledger. Not flipping pages quickly, of course. Every movement was deliberate. Pen in hand, ink occasionally replenished from a small jar, the clerk would begin the slow ritual of transcription. The gentle rhythm of counting. Counting cargo was an exercise in patience. One clove bundle. Note in ledger. Another clove bundle. Adjust pen. Slightly hum. Another. Lean back. Squint. Think about lunch. For heavier items like barrels or ingots, the process included additional steps. touching the object, nodding slowly, asking quietly, "Are you still behaving?" Recording the count. No one rushed. Haste was considered rude, to the goods, to the ink, to oneself. If a discrepancy appeared, such as a basket with fewer cloves than expected, it was addressed quietly. Curious. Indeed. Let us observe further. And that usually ended the conversation. After all, something missing today could be explained tomorrow, or the next day, or during the next monsoon. Why bother stressing now? Interacting with merchants, whispered negotiation. Merchants arriving for inspections approached the clerk slowly, deliberately, and with the expectation that their goods would be treated with respect, and also mild suspense. The interaction was calm. No shouting. No dramatic gesturing. Sometimes, even when a disagreement appeared, the solution involved gentle negotiation. Merchant: "This sack of rice is heavier than recorded." Clerk: "Is it heavier than yesterday?" Merchant: "Possibly." Clerk: "Then perhaps the scale has aged, or perhaps the sack wished to expand slightly. We will note it." Both parties would nod in quiet agreement, satisfied that the world had been observed and accounted for without unnecessary exertion. Afternoon adjustments, repetition and reflection. By afternoon, the clerk would often revisit their work. Not because the records were wrong, usually they were correct, but because repetition had a soothing quality. Rewriting numbers, recalculating totals, checking that each line in the ledger corresponded to the physical pile of goods, it all produced a gentle rhythm. Sometimes the clerk paused mid-calculation to stretch or breathe, occasionally offering soft commentary on the behavior of a stubborn barrel. "Why do you resist gravity so?" No reply. And that was expected. Cargo was notoriously uncommunicative. The role of ledger decoration. Swahili ledger pages were not blank. They contained small flourishes, faint borders, simple motifs, a sketch of a palm tree here, a tiny dhow there. Not because anyone cared deeply, but because the act of drawing while counting encouraged calm focus. Some clerks became quietly competitive over who could produce the most elegant spiral on a ledger corner, though competition was measured in half-hearted murmurs rather than loud exclamations. Evening completion and the ritual of closure. As lanterns flickered to life and the tide whispered along the docks, the clerk performed the final step, the ritual of closure. Ink jars were capped. Quills were cleaned. Ledgers were stacked neatly on a low table. A soft glance over the harbor confirmed that everything was where it should be. Then, slowly, the clerk rose and walked toward home, carrying the weight of responsibility lightly. No one thanked them. No one needed to. Their work, like all harbor routines, existed in quiet harmony with the rhythm of the day, slow, deliberate, and reassuring. Cargo accounting may have been tedious. It may have been unexciting, but it was essential. And in its own understated way, it was deeply, gently calming. As the harbor settled into the slow rhythm of evening, thoughts naturally drifted toward the next big event in the maritime calendar, the Monsoon Voyage. These were not journeys defined by sudden excitement or heroic feats. No, they were slow, meticulously planned undertakings that required patience, caution, and a level of unhurried organization that could lull even the most restless observer into a soft, contemplative state. Monsoon season dictated the movements of dhows. The winds could be relied upon, mostly, to blow steadily and predictably, but only if you had prepared your vessel and crew with gentle care. Preparation was a ritual, a series of steps designed to ease anxiety and prevent chaos without ever raising one's voice or hurrying unnecessarily. Inspecting the vessel, a meditative walk. Preparation began with the dhow itself. Captains and crew walked along the deck, inspecting planks, rigging, and sails in a slow, hypnotic manner. Each movement was deliberate. Fingers tracing ropes. Hands lightly pressing planks for suspicious softness. Squinting at the seams as though the wood might confess its secrets if examined long enough. Occasionally, a crew member would kneel, adjust a rope, or tap a plank, but nothing was rushed. This was not work to impress onlookers. It was work performed with patience, because haste could damage both vessel and cargo, and haste was universally considered rude. Sometimes a captain would pause, tilt his head, and mutter, "Oh, this looks sufficiently patient." Everyone understood the assessment. Approval was slow, subtle, and entirely non-ceremonial. Packing cargo, cloves, spices, and the gentle weight of responsibility. Cargo loading for a monsoon voyage was an art of calm repetition. Cloves, cinnamon, and other fragrant spices were handled with the utmost care. Each bundle was lifted, examined, and laid gently into its place on the deck or below. Baskets of cloves were stacked carefully, with soft layers of palm leaves separating them. Jars of preserved goods were nestled into crates to prevent shifting. Occasionally, a sailor would pause to sniff a bundle, as if verifying that the cloves remained calm. No one rushed. Quick movements were discouraged. A toppled basket could ruin the careful arrangement, or worse, bruise a particularly delicate spice pod. Such misfortune was quietly unacceptable. By late afternoon, the dhow resembled a miniature, fragrant forest of carefully arranged cargo. Sailors would pause, step back, and nod in satisfaction, not triumphantly, but with a serene acknowledgement that the vessel was ready for the long, slow journey ahead. Rations and crew preparation, the art of waiting. Sailors' rations were also prepared in a deliberate, sleepy manner. Meals were calculated not for quantity alone, but for ease of consumption during long days of sailing. Dried fish and rice, portioned into small bundles. Hard biscuits that could survive salt spray. Dates and coconuts for snacks between naps. The distribution was slow. One sailor would measure, another would nod, a third would adjust. No one hurried. Even arguing over rations was a gentle, muted affair. Crew members also prepared themselves in small rituals. Inspecting hammocks or sleeping mats for frayed edges. Oil for the hair or hands applied in careful, circular motions. Sails and ropes touched one final time to ensure nothing was misaligned. This preparation was as much about mental readiness as physical. A calm crew was essential for a calm voyage. Tying the knots of patience. Knots were a central focus of preparation. Every rope had to be tied, secured, and checked multiple times. Sailors would sit cross-legged on the deck, hands moving rhythmically, tying loops, hitches, and hawsers at a pace that was hypnotic in its consistency. A rope might be adjusted 3 times before the sailor considered it sufficiently patient. Occasionally, 2 sailors would compare knots in quiet knotting competitions, neither faster nor louder than the other. Any hastily tied or loose knots were carefully redone, often prompting soft murmurs about the wisdom of patience. Knots were more than just functional, they were symbolic. A well-tied rope represented control over both vessel and circumstance. It was the calm assurance that the monsoon winds would be met without unnecessary surprises. Navigational planning, the soft science of the winds. Charts and coastal sketches were reviewed with slow precision. Captains considered expected wind patterns, tidal timings, the gentle undulations of the Indian Ocean. Plans were made not for exactitude, but for a loose framework of expectation. Sailors discussed routes quietly, murmuring probabilities rather than issuing commands. We may see calmer waters here. Currents might slow our progress slightly. Possibly a mild swell near the shoals. The conversation was deliberate and soothing. No one became anxious. Uncertainty was acceptable as long as it was handled with patience. Evening checks, the calm ritual before departure. By evening, the dhow was almost ready. Lanterns were lit along the deck in a slow ceremonial placement, not for ceremony's sake, but for gentle illumination. Ropes were adjusted one last time. Cargo re-examined for stability. Hammocks and sleeping mats aligned neatly, ready for the long journey. Captains and crew would walk slowly along the deck, hands clasped behind their backs, murmuring soft assessments. All appears stable. We have respected the cargo today. Tomorrow, the winds will carry us gently. No one rushed. The ritual was as much about mental preparation as physical readiness. It was the final acknowledgement that the vessel, the crew, and the cargo were aligned in quiet anticipation of the ocean. The harbor at dusk, observing calmness before departure. From the shore, the dhows appeared almost as if asleep themselves. Lantern light glowed softly on carefully stacked cargo. Sailors leaned against masts in quiet observation. The water lapped gently against hulls. Even the harbor cats moved with slower precision, wandering among ropes and crates, occasionally circling a bundle of cloves or rubbing against a sailor's leg. The monsoon voyage had not yet begun, but the harbor was already in the rhythm of the journey. Preparation itself was a form of travel, slow, repetitive, and quietly hypnotic. By the time the last lantern flickered and the final sailor checked his rope, the harbor, the dhows, and everyone involved rested in a shared sense of patience. Everything was ready for tomorrow, when the monsoon winds would lift sails and begin the gentle rocking of the voyage. Once the monsoon winds finally picked up, dhows slid gently out of the harbor, guided by experienced captains and crews who had mastered the art of moving slowly, deliberately, and almost meditatively across the Indian Ocean. This was not a voyage defined by adventure or urgency. No, it was a voyage defined by rhythm, patience, and an almost sleepy harmony with the wind and tide. The ocean itself seemed to move at the same measured pace. Waves rose and fell gently, as if acknowledging that the humans aboard had no intention of racing. The sails, billowing softly, seemed to breathe with the vessel. Every movement was calibrated to avoid sudden stress, excessive exertion, or alarm. Morning routine on board. Even at sea, mornings began unhurriedly. Sailors awoke to the soft light of the rising sun, which glimmered off the calm surface of the water. There was no shouting or urgency, only a collective, slow stretch of arms and backs, occasional yawns, and quiet murmurs. Is the wind steady? Seems calm. Perhaps it will shift later, perhaps not. Breakfast, when it occurred, was simple: dried fish, rice, coconut, and a few dates. It was consumed at a pace that allowed the digestive system to fully appreciate each morsel. Conversations, if any, were muted and deliberate, often drifting into observations about the water, the clouds, or the distant hum of gulls. The captain performed a quiet inspection, walking along the deck, feeling the ropes, running fingers along the wooden planks, occasionally tapping them softly. His voice, if used at all, was low and measured. Everything appears calm today. And that was sufficient. Sailing by the tides. The monsoon winds dictated the day's progress. The dhows moved in gentle arcs, their sails shifting in a rhythm dictated by both nature and human patience. Adjustments to the sails were made slowly, methodically, and almost ritualistically. A rope was untied with deliberate care. The sail was lifted or lowered with a soft, consistent rhythm. A pause ensured that all movements were smooth. Even the most routine tasks, tying knots, shifting cargo, checking the hull, were performed in this hypnotic cadence. There was a soothing predictability in each action, which allowed the crew to move in quiet synchrony with the ocean. The day's work, quiet duties and repetitive motion. Sailors engaged in repetitive but necessary tasks throughout the day. Checking that cargo remained stable. Ensuring ropes were neither too taut nor too slack. Monitoring water levels in bilge buckets. Occasionally adjusting hammocks or mats for rest. Each task was performed with an unspoken understanding that haste was unnecessary. Mistakes caused by rushing were avoided simply by not moving quickly. The day passed in a slow loop of activity and stillness. Some sailors took naps on the deck or in the shade of the sails. Others leaned quietly against masts, eyes half closed, fingers tracing familiar knots and patterns. Even the sounds of the crew, soft conversation, the muted slap of water against wood, contributed to the hypnotic atmosphere of the voyage. Navigational meditation. The captain navigated using stars, winds, and currents, but with a calm, unhurried focus. Charts were consulted slowly. Observations were made. The wind drifts eastward. The tide is gentle. Perhaps we should adjust slightly tomorrow. Decisions were tentative and flexible. If the sea shifted unexpectedly, the response was measured. Minor sail adjustments, gentle tugs on ropes, and a slow, deliberate reassessment. Nothing was rushed, nothing panicked. Even the youngest sailors absorbed this calm, learning through quiet observation that the ocean had its own rhythm, and that survival relied on patience rather than haste. Meals at sea. Meal times were equally subdued. Cooked portions were distributed carefully. Eating was done slowly to avoid seasickness. Conversations were soft. The fish seems calm today. Yes. Calm is good. Tomorrow, perhaps the same. Even meals had a rhythm, mirroring the gentle rocking of the dhow. Eating, adjusting ropes, checking cargo, and napping became almost indistinguishable from one another, different movements in a single flowing pattern. Midday rest and reflection. By midday, the heat pressed gently on the deck, and the crew often indulged in quiet rest. Some lay down, letting the sway of the boat rock them. Others leaned against masts or low railings, eyes half closed, breathing in the scent of salt, wood, and distant spices. Reflection was part of the routine. Sailors considered the journey thus far. The wind holds steady. The cargo remains calm. We are in no rush. This reflection was rarely verbalized. Often it existed as a shared, tacit understanding of pace, patience, and the gentle forward movement of the vessel. Afternoon tasks, subtle adjustments. The later part of the day involved minor, deliberate adjustments. Shifting cargo that had moved slightly. Realigning ropes that had slackened. Checking sails for wear and tear. Each action was slow and careful, often punctuated by moments of stillness. Watching waves, listening to the wind, or simply observing distant birds that flew lazily alongside the dhow. Even when a problem arose, a tangled rope, a minor leak, a slightly wet spice container, the solution was measured and calm. Untie, adjust, nod, return to rhythm. No urgency, no drama, no loud commands. Evening descent into drowsiness. As the sun lowered and the ocean glimmered in soft hues of orange and blue, the crew's activities gradually slowed further. Lanterns might be lit, though more often the fading light sufficed for quiet observation. Conversations dwindled. Napping became more common. The gentle swaying of the dhow encouraged a communal sense of drowsiness. Even the waves seemed to move more slowly, reflecting the uniform calm of human motion aboard the vessel. The captain walked the deck once more, hand on the railing, eyes scanning the horizon. He murmured softly, "All is as it should be." And it was. By nightfall, the dhow floated in steady motion, cargo secure, sails aligned, and crew content to drift along with the monsoon, perfectly synchronized with the slow, rhythmic heartbeat of the ocean. As darkness settled over the Indian Ocean, the monsoon winds whispered softly against the sails, and the dhow continued its steady, hypnotic glide. Nights at sea were neither dramatic nor restless. They were a quiet extension of the day's calm, a time when sailors and cargo alike surrendered to the gentle rhythms of water, wind, and lantern light. The night was long, slow, and almost ceremonial in its repetition. Even minor tasks were performed with measured, deliberate care. Nothing was hurried. Everything moved in harmony with the sway of the dhow. It was the maritime equivalent of bedtime, but extended across a horizon of dark, soft waves. Lanterns and low light. Lanterns provided soft illumination, their flickering glow casting long, lazy shadows across the deck. Sailors adjusted them sparingly, careful not to disrupt the tranquil atmosphere. One lantern was hung near the cargo, highlighting neatly stacked baskets of cloves, rice, and other spices. Another illuminated the navigation station, its gentle light revealing charts, ropes, and a quietly observant captain. Occasionally, a lantern was moved to allow a crew member to repair a minor tear in the sail, performed with slow, hypnotic precision. The light, never harsh, helped maintain the calming rhythm of the night. It created a world in which the ocean, the dhow, and the sailors were connected in a soft, luminous cocoon. Crew sleep and resting patterns. Sailors' rest was carefully orchestrated. Hammocks and mats were arranged so that no one disturbed another's sleep. Crew members rotated minimal duties, allowing most to recline and drift off. Sleep was not rushed. Even in the middle of the night, if someone stirred to check a line or adjust cargo, their movements were quiet, unhurried, almost reverent. The night resembled a sleepy village more than a busy ship. Only the gentle creak of wood, the soft slap of water against the hull, and the occasional whisper of wind marked the passage of time. Midnight watches, quiet vigil. A few sailors remained awake, performing midnight watches with calm focus. They did not pace, shout, or gesture. They moved slowly along the deck, checking ropes, examining sails, and observing the sea. The captain occasionally joined, standing silently, hands behind his back, eyes scanning the dark horizon. Conversations were minimal, simple observations about stars, wind direction, or distant lights. Any anomaly, such as a slightly shifted basket or a slack rope, was corrected without fuss. These watches were meditative, almost like a slow night prayer. The ocean itself seemed to respond, rolling gently, rocking the dhow as if acknowledging the calm presence of its crew. Stargazing and reflection. At certain points, sailors paused to observe the sky. Stars were plentiful, unencumbered by city lights, and seemed to drift slowly above the ship. Orion, the Pleiades, and the Southern Cross appeared with reassuring constancy. Sailors traced constellations with their fingers, making mental notes for navigation or simply admiring the patterns. Thoughts wandered to home ports, markets, and families. This quiet reflection contributed to the hypnotic rhythm of the night. Thoughts moved slowly, much like the vessel itself, drifting and meandering without urgency. Maintenance in the moonlight. Minor repairs and adjustments continued under the soft glow of moonlight or lanterns. Ropes were retied, knots adjusted. Sails mended gently, stitch by stitch. Cargo shifted imperceptibly to ensure balance. Even small tasks were performed as part of a larger rhythm, methodical, unhurried, and integrated into the natural motion of the ocean. No one rushed. Even mistakes were corrected with patience, sometimes after a silent pause or contemplative sigh. The soundscape of night. The auditory environment was soothing. The gentle slap of waves against the hull. Occasional creaking of wood under the sway of the tide. Soft murmurings of a half-asleep crew. Lanterns clinking faintly as they moved. The whispering wind through the rigging. Together, these sounds created a steady, calming rhythm. Sailors often remarked, quietly, that the ocean's nocturnal symphony was preferable to the chaos of the harbor. The role of silence. Silence dominated the night as much as movement. Conversations were minimal, footsteps light, and laughter rare. Even the occasional cough or sneeze was subdued. This silence was intentional, almost sacred. It allowed crew, cargo, and vessel to exist in harmony. The gentle rocking of the dhow, combined with the muted world around it, created an environment conducive to both reflection and sleep. Pre-dawn preparations. As the night slowly approached its end, a few sailors began preliminary preparations for morning, checking the horizon for changes in wind direction, observing tide patterns, ensuring cargo remained in position. These tasks were deliberate, performed with a soft awareness of the approaching day. Even at this early hour, nothing was rushed. Movements were slow, methodical, and integrated into the continuous rhythm of ocean and vessel. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, the crew had completed their quiet preparations, ready for another day at sea, still maintaining the slow, hypnotic pace that defined life aboard a Swahili dhow. The night at sea, in its gentle, repetitive, and carefully measured activities, was perhaps the ultimate example of sleepy maritime life. No urgency, no drama, just an endless, soothing cycle of movement, observation, and quiet reflection.